Hello folks, Shane here. Just dropping in at the start to remind you that we're taking submissions for those who'd like to try out to become a party member. Just record yourself doing 5 to 10 minutes of talk about gaming topics of your choice and send that recording to party@theadventuringparty.net. You don't have to be based in Dublin or even in Ireland, as long as you have a connection to the Irish gaming scene and are willing to contribute. Now, on with the show. You're listening to The Adventuring Party for the second week of February 2020. This week, the party discussed tutorial scenarios in RPGs, the adventures that teach both players and game masters how to play their games and show them the tricks and trade of the hobby. The Adventuring Party, discussing tabletop and related gaming and the Irish gaming scene, so you don't have to.
Welcome to the party. I'm Savage.
I'm Lee.
I'm Conrad.
And I'm Sean.
And we are here today, this week, to discuss a topic that's kind of popped up in a few different conversations I've been having the last while about how to tutorialize when it comes to introducing both players and games masters to the delicate art of running a scenario, of getting from A to B in a dungeon or probably a more involved kind of game. Now, we've got a little bit of prep done on this one, so we've got some examples with us and some champions for different examples.
Well, mainly because you said something. You pointed out Conrad had picked out a few that were good examples, and when you were bringing up, you said, because there are no others, and I said, how dare you?
A challenge was issued.
Challenge accepted. I'll find some alternatives, which I only have one opinion, so I brought Dungeons and Dragons 5 examples.
Our fellow shocking nobody. Our fellow host, Owen, would be of the opinion that a lot of the sort of example scenarios you get in books aren't terribly good.
He's not wrong.
I think one of the reasons is because they're examples of how the game might be played or the sort of tonal setting for the scenario, but they don't tend to tell you how to play a game.
I think an awful lot of them fall down the opposite way.
Oh?
They focus entirely, they're like, okay, here you go, bam, 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 here's a fight, da, 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 and it gives you the mechanics of the game, but it doesn't give you any of the setting or feeling for it.
But even there, I think there's lots of unspoken rules. There's almost sort of, they're system agnostic or systemless rules about how certain things happen. If someone says to you, we're going into a dungeon, there's things you assume about that as a player because of your long experience. You don't assume that you're going to be able to, say, dig up the entire dungeon and get to the end room first. No, you're going to have to go through a sort of a snaking corridor.
If you look at the classic one for, say, Shadowrun, the classic one for Shadowrun was always Food Fight. The classic one for a lot of iterations of D&D, just to give people a flow for the game, was to have a bar brawl. Those aren't really indicative of the games themselves. No, but we're talking about scenarios written to actually say something about how this type of game should run or this type of scenario should run.
I think a system that does this extremely well, probably because it's had 7 editions and those scenarios have been repeated in multiple editions, is Call of Cthulhu. Both The Haunting, Paper Chase, and there is another one at Edge of Darkness. That's the one, Edge of Darkness, which I think first appeared in the 5th edition rulebook. Those have been played multiple times, but they cleave to the core activities of the game itself, which is investigation, gathering documents, interviewing witnesses, and putting things together, but also with a dash of magic and a few monsters.
So good examples of what you should expect in Call of Cthulhu and how an investigation scenario should unfold.
Very much so.
Okay. D&D have anything to say on the matter?
So I wouldn't consider myself a mouthpiece on D&D because I didn't really play it until 5th edition and I didn't really like it either.
You're a subject matter expert on 5th edition.
Subject matter expert on 5th edition.
Sean, converts are usually the most zealous of people.
That's my weakness. So I brought along the 2 starter boxes for 5th edition. I noticed one of them is well thumbed and one of them is pristine because I have not read it. I just kind of brought along as more of a curiosity. Lost Minds of Phandelver is the D&D 5th edition box, and I've run it a half dozen times as a DM and about twice as a player because I think it is not just an excellent starter adventure, but an excellent adventure. But in this case, I brought it up as an excellent starter adventure. Dragons of Icespire Peak I just have here as a curiosity because it's basically a toolbox that you can use to expand Lost Mines of Phandelver are also, I think it's specifically written that you can play it with one GM and one player.
So starter set, then moving on to essential kit.
Yeah, the Icespire Peak is more if two kids want to play D&D and they don't have friends and no one's ever taught them before. That's sort of everything. But I bring up Lost Mines of Phandelver here because I do think it's a good scenario for this, because it's broken into these different chapters and every chapter is a different kind of adventure. So chapter 1 is like an ambush leading to a small cave where there's a few different opportunities to do different things. So a monster, you can negotiate with a monster who is a boss. Chapter 2 is like a town, you just explore. There is people to meet, people who give you quests. There's a haunted manor, options, right? Chapter 3 is then a big open countryside you wander in and go
sandbox,
sandbox, go where you please. And then finally chapter 4 is a big sort of mega dungeon full of mysteries and monsters and bosses and weird stuff.
I think for that starter set, I think that it is a fine intro to 5th Ed for experienced gamers and not necessarily experienced gamers, experienced GMs. I don't know that it does that good a job for a new GM if someone isn't familiar with how to run.
I would have considered myself a new GM when I wrote this.
But still an experienced gamer.
I guess enough. I'd run one game before I ran Lost Mines of Phandelver, and that didn't go very well.
Yeah.
And I consider this book to have taught me how to DM games.
So what Liam said there, I think, is kind of core to what I'm pushing for in this episode.
Yeah.
This idea that there's this language of gaming that is so foundational that it's almost never brought up.
Yeah.
Now, Conrad, you've got a copy of Tomb of the Snake King in front of you, don't you?
Tomb of the Serpent King version 4.
By
V4.
Skerples, whose real name is a mystery to me, but who is of the Coins and Scrolls blog.
Now, he has a paragraph right at the start that I think really cements this.
I think I'll actually just briefly read it out because it's short
enough.
It cleaves quite carefully. So it begins like this. When you first start up Super Mario Brothers, the game doesn't give you any instructions. The first level is cunningly designed to teach you the rules. Jump on enemies, pick up mushrooms, look for secrets, get coins, avoid pits. There is no tutorial. The game itself is the tutorial. Now, he goes on to describe some of the classic dungeons of Dungeons & Dragons, but he said, "It's like all the adventures we have are Bach concertos. People keep writing amazing works of staggering genius, but someone needs to write a book on how to play the piano. This dungeon is designed to be classic without being full of callbacks and nostalgia. It has some but not all of the major tropes." And he essentially describes it as a small dungeon which can be played in 2 to 3 sessions, that covers a lot of the basic blocks of Dungeons and Dragons. But what I think is particularly interesting about this is, firstly, it's an introduction for players, but it is also an introduction for GMs because the thing has been extensively play tested. This is the 4th edition of this particular scenario. And
the last time you met anyone who's keeping track of how often they'd edited a scenario.
Exactly, which is wonderful, but it editorializes as you go through the scenario, going, here's somewhere where you might have to push the players, or here's something where the players can learn something about, for example, dungeon exploration scenario, like listening at doors might be a good thing, or you can outwit traps if you examine them carefully. The scenario itself is a small dungeon. It has some monsters, it has some mysteries, it has some things you can explore. It's system agnostic, but it's basically aimed at D20 style games. I gave a copy to a friend of mine at work, and she ran it as her first game using 5th edition and was able to convert it very easily in about half an hour. And if it has a weakness, it's a little light on role-playing, but there's a lot of exploration, there's a lot of puzzles.
It's a dungeon crawl.
It's a dungeon crawl. Yeah. And there's a few fights, and the fights are all different, and the enemies that you encounter can be dealt with in different ways.
Okay. Liam, you've got your own feelings on this one. I mean, do you have a good example of one that you think does teach the basics well, or is there really a need for this sort of thing? Is it more... Does some of this just feel like a little bit too much hand-holding, or shaping GMs into a particular mould?
I mean, I think if you read through a lot of the books, so if you read through your D&D book, or if you read through the Pathfinder GM's Guide and the D&D GM's Guide, that's where they do a lot of the teaching. This is how you structure a dungeon. This is how you put this together. This is how you do all this kind of stuff. But I don't feel that most of the starter sets have really brought those lessons in.
Right.
I think even that starter set from 5th Ed, and I'm talking about that rather than the stuff that Conrad has brought because I'm familiar with it. The first kind of fight, so it may be that the first interaction you have with that game is taking out the scouts, taking out the sentries outside of the kind of the mine, outside the fortress. You then go up, and then if you kind of go hand-fisted straight in there, you set off the entire fortress and they're all coming out at you.
Right.
And I think it would be very easy for a GM to fall into that trap and for the players to get taken out by everybody coming in there. And it tells you this is where everybody is. And this is the reaction. This guy runs off and gets reinforcements, and then everybody comes in, and then suddenly the entire force comes in. And then trying to keep track of the numbers of where is where, I think could be very daunting for a beginner GM. So I think from that point of view, it could, just that encounter alone, if that's the first experience that you're coming at in D&D, that could leave a very sour taste for a new GM and for new players.
Right. Sean, there's a couple of bits about failure states in the starting adventure. Is it good advice?
I honestly, I think it is. Yeah, there's often
the way it's formatted in terms of indoor, outdoor, all that kind of stuff, giving different flavors to the game. I think that's quite good. But I'd say I think that itself is problematic. That boom, the entire fort is on you and everybody's dead.
Which could be a valuable learning experience.
Sorry. Again, I've run this game 6 times. I don't know what you're talking about. I genuinely have no idea what you're talking about.
So what happens if we get into the first room and then Sentry runs off and alerts everybody in all the different rooms and everybody starts throwing towards the front of the fort?
I never run it like that. Maybe that's just a choice to make his GM. I never run it. He runs his next room and he gets the guys in the next room and they come in and that's that.
And is that because you understand how this might go south?
No, I never domino the whole fortress simply because I do.
That's what's in there.
No, it's not.
Yes, it is.
I don't believe it is.
It's
no, he isn't.
For anyone who cares to stick with.
So I do think so. Partly, the reason I kind of landed is the whole Super Mario thing. This largely doesn't call out when it's teaching you. It kind of throws out every encounter throws out is a different kind of encounter, a different kind of role-play encounter, and it just goes, here's one, here's a different one, here's a different one, and it just runs you players through them one by one. It does the very initial encounter. It calls out what you might do if you get a TPK, which I think is a valuable lesson because a lot of DMs, young DMs, when they encounter a TPK, they just kind of throw their hands up and go, this is a bad system or this is a bad game. Whereas this one quite cleverly goes, hey, if the goblins kill all the players, have the players wake up in an hour stripped of their valuables, which is the easiest
classic reset.
The classic.
That's something the system allows as well, though, which I think is clever enough to make it a kind of a more friendly system. If you're playing something a lot more lethal, then the players are dead tough.
And
that's a very explicit call out in the Lost Mines.
Yes.
Whereas this indie stuff we're looking at, the Skerples. I'm definitely going to get that wrong again.
Tomb of the Serpent King.
He does editorialize, as you say, and he does say this is an example of a trap room. This is an example of a fight.
So, for example, there's a box, there's a series of guard rooms, and
Liam's gone digging for evidence of his
yes, he has.
I'm actually thinking I might be mixing this up with the what's the compilation adventure book and the first adventure in that?
Oh, that one does do what you're talking about.
That one's dangerous.
That's
Harmony Reigns.
Do pay attention, 007.
That's a start adventure for turn that he's talking about.
Okay,
so for example, it mentions that this is a tomb, they're exploring it. It said, the dungeon is organised. There are patterns, there is hidden treasure, there is also hidden danger. So the PCs encounter a number of coffins. So the PCs will probably approach the second coffin with more caution and earn their reward, that is gold, without the danger, poison, by using their brains and possibly a long stick.
I quite like that. I mean, I like that as a teaching method. Yes. I like that because I feel it's not doing what they said they were setting out to do, which is teaching people without words, which I think this does do, because this has an example of every kind of encounter, but it never holds a DM by the hand and tells them this is what you're going to walk into. It's very much learned by experience, but and there's encounters in this that I didn't realize until my second or third time through what it was the lesson it was supposed to be teaching.
Right,
but
it's explicit in this.
To have it called out to a new DM is perfect.
Yeah. I think there's definitely a hole there that could be filled up with a lot more material like this. And the big box guys are doing a very good job in presenting simple, fairly easy to run stuff.
Yeah.
and then the players' guide or the DM's guides, the sort of lore masters' guides, whatever,
DM's
do have useful sort of theory craft and abstractions.
Yeah, I would
but
say
putting it all together into a working document. I'm big on working documents in role playing. Having it actually explicitly there for a GM and a new group to work through is kind of an interesting place that I don't think we've seen a huge amount of exploration, and potentially there's a lot more to be done.
I don't think DM guides really teach the lessons we're talking about here. I feel they're more about crafting campaigns.
Yes.
And building dungeons, building encounters in dungeons, crafting campaigns, but not about how to DM at the table. There's little nods to it here.
A lot of them do actually have good advice in there. Like they do have, how do you handle the person who's hogging the GM's time?
I've seen that. And like who brings, even down to things like who brings the snacks and how to adjudicate.
Actually, with reference to that, 2 books that I think do that very well, which actually go back to AD&D, was the Dungeoneer's Guide and I think the Wilderness Guide, which you have copies of, Savage.
They're in pristine condition. I don't know how you manage that.
Yes, but where they explicitly dealt with this is the mechanics of running a game. You know, do you want to? I can't remember exactly how the initiative rules worked in first edition Dungeons and Dragons, but do you want to seat people in an additional in initiative order? Do you different ways of approaching the game to maximize your enjoyment at a very sort of structural level rather than referring to specific mechanics.
No, essentially the Pathfinder and 5th edition DMs guys do have that kind of generic advice, but not in, as you were describing, a working document, a hold your hand, let me teach you the way.
Yeah.
They don't like all the advice is in there, but that's a big tome you got to go and read, and
I think
not
in
in a
general,
structured way.
I mean, I have never really, even when I was learning stuff, I don't know that I read the DM guide in 3.5, which would have been when I was learning to GM.
Yeah.
Aside from how to calculate yours. That's about the only thing I ever did in that book.
I've read half the 5th ed DM's guide. It's good stuff, but it doesn't do what these...
So 2 things occur to me off the back of all of this. One, I'll play devil's advocate on my own argument and say, I think there's a real danger with this kind of material that you start to turn out a lot of copycat GMs and players. And we've talked about the Mercer effect in other podcasts, and it's talked about in terms of how it kind of skews how people play. And I think while arpeggios are good, while it's kind of nice to have a D&D driving test, I wonder, is there a danger that it would all sort of push towards a particular... Every dungeon is going to sort of play the same because they've all learned the same lessons. They've all learned to play in the same way. Yeah. Whereas D&D's always been a bit jazzy.
I think
Gentlemen, please be aware, it is the 24th, possibly the 25th of January 2020. Yeah. And Savage is warning us of role players not being rugged individualists. I will mark this day in my calendar.
Anyway, what was the second thing that occurred to me?
Well, I mean, it can also be down to the player and the group as well. Like, I mean, I know when I was younger, I was very much... The rules is written, very strict, and I went for very mechanical games.
Oh boy,
big in the Pathfinder.
Big
very
portion
much,
of the congregation never get past that.
Mechanics. Now I'm older. It's much more.
You've learned the truth.
Is everybody having fun?
Yeah, which is hard to tutorialize.
Now I still like a little bit of grit. I still like a little bit of tactics. That's why I've never really particularly shone on 5th ed, because I found that there's no customization in your character. There's no mechanical stuff in your character. It's all just very light.
Yeah.
But
that's why I love it.
Yeah, so but that's up to the group and player.
Let's be clear, we're not attempting to conjure up a formula for the secret sauce. That is, like, you're going to get, like good piano players, you're going to get some GMs and players who can just bring out a concerto, and there's others where it'll always be sort of chopsticks.
Have you ever watched improv workshops?
Occasionally, yes. Yeah.
Most of them are dire.
Oh yeah,
it's very hard to teach people how to improvise.
But yes, sand.
But you have to fail first. You do have to fail first.
Yeah.
So what this doesn't have, what none of these have, that I would kind of point to, is some throwaway characters. Oh, there probably are in the starting set.
You mean like
if you're going to learn, you don't want to learn when it's important.
Oh yeah, no, sorry.
There's pre-gens in Lost Minds of Phandelver.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Now, how many
pre-gens actually tie into the story?
Now, how many people do you think will use them instead of taking their most precious character that they came up with and a backstory for, who then gets killed?
When I was run through that, what we did is that everybody kind of played the first session with the pre-gens and then made their own.
Which I think is the way to do it, yes.
That's one thing that I did as well when I was running through the Warfrup starter set for the current edition of Warfrup from Cube 7. I ran everybody through, and for the first session, everybody ran with the NPCs, and then they made their own characters. Now, the big flaw that I thought was those characters are not legal characters. They were generated like NPCs. They weren't generated like PCs.
That was a problem.
And I think it was a big missed opportunity for them. I think that they could have made these characters book legal and that they were made like this, listed an amount of XP, and listed how those characters got there. And that would have been a really good example for character crafting as well. Does that mean,
in mechanical terms, those characters had training wheels on them?
Yeah, they were overstated characters that were basically would have blasted through the entire starter box.
The problem with the characters was how to advance in Warfrup, you need to know how you got to where you were. Because how much an advancement costs depends on what advancements you've already bought. So the characters and starters could not be advanced. I love the characters and starters. I wanted to continue with them.
Your character that lady had a fabulous hat.
She had a fabulous hat. Oh my god, it was so good.
For no other reason than the hat.
No, actually,
giant feathers. Yeah.
I've run Phandelver a few times. I find it runs best when I do not allow the players to make their own characters. I find it's tuned for the classes to come in that box. Just something like adding a warlock into the party trivializes half the campaign.
Okay. I mean, then you could also, I guess it's you've run that, you know that there's no warning there saying do not let a character create.
There's no warning saying don't let people create stuff. I find it runs best with the inbuilt characters.
Going back to, and this just occurred to me, I wasn't intending to talk about this, but a really good example of a book that did teach very basic GMing skills through the medium of play was Dungeoneer, which I think was written by Mark Gascoigne. It was part of the Advanced Fighting Fantasy series of books that came out.
Adventure novels?
It was a role-playing game based on the Choose Your Own Adventure books, and that had, I think it was called The Shadow of the Sorcerer, which essentially had a series of encounters, told the GM why those encounters were there, things that might happen, and what to do if the wheels came off the wagon.
I think the further back you go in the publishing history, you're more likely to encounter that because they were sort of having to explain it themselves as much as anyone else.
Very much so.
There's a lot of givens that are sort of assumed now.
Well, I suppose you have access to with the advent of actual play and Matt Mercer et al.
Let's be his name.
You can actually the bar for entry is much lower, because if you were a 10-year-old in 1990, as I was, and you got this book in a shop, you had to use this book to figure it out. You couldn't go on YouTube and see a game actually being played.
People have picked up skills has changed hugely with the advent of the likes of YouTube.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, to the point, I would say, 3 of the last 4 Wizards releases are directly taken from popular properties. So they did a book based on that game that Penny Arcade do on YouTube.
Acquisitions Incorporated.
A book based on Acquisitions Incorporated. They have a book coming out based on Critical Role, Matt Mercer's property.
But I mean,
they had a starter set based on Stranger Things and a starter set based on Rick and Morty. Like, they're clearly trying to get new people playing. These are products
that's just Premier League Monopoly. Like, I mean, that's just taking an IP and sticking it on. It's sticking a sticker on.
But it's getting new people into the game.
It is, but it's not doing anything to do that so much as this will entice these people in. Let's buy them in.
We're sitting around here. We're all steeped in gaming in one direction,
to one degree or another.
And we've talked about starter sets, and we've talked about an example of a starting adventure. This Skerples, Mr. Sklepres,
Ivan Skerplovich,
he came out with another product that I thought was even more interesting, because it's called, what is it called there, Conrad?
It's called Kidnap the Archpriest.
Now, this is not for baby's first GMing or baby's first gaming.
It isn't.
Is that not the one you were talking about a second ago?
This is another one.
No, this is a new one. I will give you both of them if you wish.
This is the heist, and this is a systemless, kind of fairly light on mechanical details scenario called
Kidnap the Archpriest,
and it's about a heist.
Yes.
And a heist is a classic, obviously, of many sort of types of games, but they're notoriously difficult to run.
So from my point, I constantly hear the heists are like classics. I've encountered one heist in my time, which is dragon heist.
And it wasn't the heist.
It's not a heist.
A lot of, I guess it's just that a lot of the hobby takes stuff from media, and in media, the heist is a classic. There are so many heist movies.
The first Conan
and
movie
people
is a
love
heist.
them. And when people think about gaming, they often take their cues.
Where Eagles
from-
Dare is a heist, and a great one.
We so often try to emulate them, but it's very hard to
Kelly's
find
Heroes.
a good example of
Exactly.
a well-written scenario that is a good heist.
Yeah.
Even things with heist in the title have proven not to be good heists. But this is another tutorialized example of how to run a heist, or a way to run a heist.
And it is a very good heist indeed. So what distinguishes Kidnap the Archpriest from Tomb of the Serpent Kings is this is hugely role-playing heavy, and it is very good, and it essentially it does the plot is that you have been hired by the king to kidnap, the fantasy equivalent of the Pope, but it is aimed at D20 games, so it's sort of explicitly aimed at D&D or a version of D&D, so you could play it with, I don't know, Lamentations of Flame Princess or Beck Me original D&D or 5th Ed. People have run it with 5th Ed. I think there's actually a conversion online to run it with 5th Ed where it's all been statted.
Let's talk about how it teaches a heist.
Essentially what it does is that it talks about time, money and information, and it presents an objective where you have to kidnap this senior cleric, and you have limited time in which to accomplish this. You have some resources which you can use to buy information, and it presents you with a number of locations and a number of NPCs and different ways of putting them together. So you could run this 3 times, and depending on how the players approach it, you will not run the same heist in the same way. The other thing is that there is a section at the back in general terms talking about how to create heist adventures and how to certainly.
And it has lots of these little features in it that when I read it I thought, oh yeah, that's stuff I would need to know or should have thought about if I'm going to do heist.
Exactly.
And there's little sort of touches. There's maps in it, of course, which are essential for running almost any sort of role-playing game in some sense. You might not be putting the maps on the table, but you at least need to be able to refer to them. But what it has there that only a few other games have done, especially because it's a heist that's targeting a particular location, is it has the exterior views of that location that you can show players and go, this is what, if you're across the road scoping out this palace, this is what you see. And I think stuff like that is actually foundational for heists, especially, but so few. Shane, you came across something. Sean, you came across something.
Yeah, no, I was when you gave me a flip through this one earlier, which there is so much going on in that book. That makes
You're
me
a little daunted.
Yeah, it looks really daunting. That's too much for me, I think. But you showed me the pictures of the front and side elevations of the dungeon, and I thought that is brilliant because it's something I only noticed a couple times. You almost never get an external view of what players are going into, and I have been asked for that by players, and I'm just...
every time, yeah. Well, what does it look like? I can show you a top-down view, but I can't show you what it looks like.
I ran through... I spent a year running a party through Storm King's Thunder, and there are a lot of dungeons in that, and, it's one of those things where, 5 dungeons, pick one. Here's another 3 dungeons, pick one. But only 2 dungeons in the entire book give an external view of what's presented to the players. Everything else just gives top-down elevations.
Yep.
Well, interestingly, and this is a sort of a broader comment about Skerples' work, is that he's sort of philosophically opposed to art that the players don't get to see.
Yeah.
So everything that's in there is something that you could print out and here is a picture of this NPC. This is a picture of this building. There are means of the players can get copies of the maps and get the floor plans.
But if that's
the floor plans are like in-world floor plans as opposed to like, here is a grid.
They're both.
Oh, it's both.
Which I think is extremely clever. He also has a breakdown of what every NPC is doing at all times over the 48 hours that you have, and that you can examine that. But it's simply a means of, well, if you need to know where they are, that's where you can find out.
That is something that I'm sure somebody has done online, but say for the rough nights and hard days, that would be very useful because there's a lot of most of the games have 6 or 7 plots going on, and I could see for a novice GM that being quite challenging. Whereas that format of information where everybody is at every time would be very much helpful for that.
So I thought these are useful exercises in terms of figuring out how to write scenarios that teach you as a player or GM something about this style of scenario. It's I think there's plenty of other space to be explored. We've had beginner dungeon and heist.
Yes.
I mean, we get the huge social interaction aspects of the Wolfrup campaign, Rough Nights.
But that's not a beginner thing. It's not
a beginner.
It's just. I just mentioned it as something. Seeing that
it's got a timeline.
Way to handle a complex timeline that you were daunted by. For me, I looked at fantastic.
Yeah.
This is such a great aid because it's 5 o'clock and I need to know what's happening with this person. They're there. Quick.
Just from I was just thinking of it the wrong way. As a reference, that would be wonderful.
Yes.
Especially in something like the final chapter of Rough Nights and Hard Days. If I was preparing a scenario and I looked at that and I'm like, "What? I have to read all this? Get out of here!"
Well, interestingly enough, he also includes advice on how to prep the scenario, which basically involves let the players have their heads, see what they want to do. They encounter 3 or 4 NPCs, then you forget about the rest of the NPCs and you run with the guys you have, because they can all. You can sort of put a heist together based on whichever ones they go for.
And it doesn't matter what the deacon's doing.
Yeah, that in and of itself is a great lesson, that you could start with 7 or 8 opportunities and then let the players decide what's important, and then you sort of filter down to that.
Yeah,
but it's explicitly said there, and I think that's the same thing.
It's great if you're a very experienced juggler. You can keep 7 balls in the air.
Off you go.
You know.
But your players won't be able to keep track of it. What's the point?
But as a junior, let's say freshman, a freshman DM, it's sort of refreshing to be given permission to do that.
Yeah.
Well, the thing that I think marks this out is that this isn't for first game. This is for someone who's been running.
Who's run a few games.
Sounds like the advice could be good for someone who's not a full novice, but
nothing wrong with sitting down. I wouldn't credit myself as being anything other than sort of
sometimes it needs to be spelled out.
Exactly.
Particularly if you're not confident in your skills as a GM, you might not be willing to make big calls and twists.
That's an important thing, really. Is so you've gone through your starter set. You're starting to take the trainer wheels off.
Yeah.
Where do you go next?
Yeah.
Well, if this lesson was so obvious, why would I need to tell you? Of course it's not obvious. That's why I need to tell you.
Yeah.
My hope is that we see more products like this, more projects like this, that result in more people going, I think I could write one of these, and writing better examples of all of these kinds of games that don't necessarily have to be tutorials, but have their own spins, have their own twists and turns, but have foundational lessons learned that make for better games overall. Any final thoughts, guys?
I would like to reiterate that Tomb of the Serpent Kings is absolutely stinking free on Drive-Thru RPG, so you can get that for a handshake. And Kidnap the Archpriest is, I think, 5 or 6 quid. It's about the price of a pint.
Toss a coin to your Witcher and
exactly
get a decent tutorial on how to write heists, because he has some workbook notes and pages back as well.
Yeah.
D&D getting it right, tutorializing properly, or could we all hope for a little more in the future?
From the adventures I've read, Phandelver does a lot more than some, but look, like having heard some of the stuff from that, you can do a lot better. I mean, my philosophy is always you can always do better.
Exactly.
But certainly there's a lot of scope to improve, particularly for teaching new people.
Liam?
I can't say much. I'll say that the Wolfrup starter set does a great job of teaching you Wolfrup, but it does not do a great job of teaching you GMing. And I must withdraw my Skerples accusation against all the lines of Phandelver starter set, because I mixed it up with an adventure from Tales of Neon Import.
Fight avoided, accusations rescinded, and hopefully we can all learn a little something from tutorialized scenarios. And with that, I'm going to say that this party is over.
Thanks for listening to The Adventuring Party. You can find show notes and links to things we mentioned at our website, theadventuringparty.net, and on our Facebook page. The hosts can be contacted directly by email at Liam, Sean, and Savage at theadventuringparty.net. The Adventuring Party is released under a Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial Share-alike version 3 license.